COVID that was set up, and let's have solidarity funds in every province. Now, how are you going to benefit? So everybody should bid for projects to create jobs and whatever. So how can we innovate in terms of the institutions? For me, that's very critical, yeah. While we fix this,
No, really good questions.
Yeah.
Even if you're a Tottenham supporter, you're still very smart. So, one of the first things I learned from you, Busani, it was the first meeting we had. Well, the first and only live one, because then COVID struck. It was March 2020. And we were in Pretoria, and we were talking about government and capacity. And you said, Mariana, do you realize that one of the things, for example, that's happening here, but that you were talking about, that you were witnessing globally, is that we talk about the need to tackle these problems, and then we end up cutting. You talked about the National Statistics Authority. So the ability of government even to govern, the difficult, fast forward, infodemic side of COVID requires knowledge about data, of digital governance, coming back to my point about Deloitte getting the contract for test and trace. So we sometimes forget, especially on the left, when people talk about the problems with austerity, just cutting, that it's not about austerity as this big blob. It's actually the institutions that themselves have been decimated. In the UK, for example, money comes and goes. We've had governments that have reduced the public budget, those that have increased it. But what we've actually seen over the last 50 years is a weakening of the institutional capacity itself. We're seeing it today with the BBC, by the way. There's just by being constantly under attack, then it itself starts to shy away. It doesn't even kind of play its bold role that it used to play. So that kind of, where should this governance then happen? Do we need a parallel government or not? One of the things we try to do precisely in this Mission-Oriented Innovation Network, where we met today here at the School of Governance, but also in my institute in general, is to say we need to actually learn also from the positive stuff that's happening on the ground, even in quite problematic countries. Again, I would definitely not point to the UK today as good governance or good government, but there's still really interesting things happening at the institutional level. The question is, can we look at it with a microscope in the same way that, say, Harvard Business School looks at case studies on the private sector, and that case study methodology has been, is all over the world in terms of MBAs and business schools. I'm sure in your own business school you have a case study methodology. We haven't done proper case studies in the public sector. What works, what doesn't? And when it works, how do we scale it up? What are the lessons? What would it look like if the system actually worked that way? And that's why I'm really interested in things like outcomes-oriented procurement and understanding why the cost-plus model doesn't work and why it's open to gaming and capture more than the fixed price with incentives for innovation and quality improvement, why we then need to kind of sandbox that around social problems. Why is it that we only use outcomes-oriented procurement around the military-industrial complex problems or during COVID when millions of people are dying? What would it look like to do what Sweden does, for example? Forget Sweden as a country, I'm interested in the experiments, where they, at a high level, said we want a fossil-free welfare state, but then they bring it down to the everyday. So school lunches in Sweden have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable. Lunch becomes the moonshot. And because it's seen in this kind of bold way, that's why it then needs lots of different sectors to interact in a new way, why the government has to interact in a new way with small, medium enterprises that are procuring in healthy, tasty, sustainable food. You can get kids in the schools to participate in the design of the lunches. They can learn about it through the curriculum, so that issue also participatory governance can be learned a bit from an experiment like that. But that might sound like a tiny little who cares, but it's only by sandboxing and learning what did it look like to procure in food for free school meals with an innovation lens, so it becomes part of your innovation budget, right, on everything we do, as opposed to seeing innovation just on one side of the economy and the rest of government just being a bit of a basket case. Another example in the UK that I learned from, that we did a case study, as I mentioned, GDS. GDS was set up by this iPlayer team, where the first thing they did was to say, let's stop talking about people in the country as though they're just clients and customers. People as customers in a hospital, clients in a school, government digital services. Okay. They said people need to use a digital platform by government, and we need to increase the user experience, so it's fulfilling when you're getting your passport, your driver's license, your voting registration, as opposed to wanting to shoot yourself because the forms take forever. and with a human rights perspective. They ended up winning an international design award because it was so innovative. And it was also potentially, it didn't then happen, so also learning from the failures are important, going to help the different departments work interministerially. Because anytime you have an outcomes orientation around, say, net zero or well-being, it can't be for one ministry. Climate is not just for the Department of Energy. Well-being is not just for the Department of Health. Having that, those different ministries working together and having a platform, a digital platform that allows data sharing and so on, was their goal. So I do think that we need to look also where government works, these interesting examples, and then learn both between governments but within government. But the problem is, if we give up on government, if we just see the corruption, if we just talk about the nepotism, the state capture, the positive goal of actually improving that state capacity through a revolutionary and radical program of investment within civil service, perhaps that can come from the outside. I'm not saying our institute, but anyway, through the National School of Government, through the Wit School of Governance, bringing in a really bold new curricula that's outside of the status quo. I actually think that's one of the best places to begin.